All right. Well, usually when you mention the word Civil War medicine, people usually think of, people getting their arms and legs amputated, but there's a lot more to it than just that. So, just before the war began in the 1840s and 1850s, the big thing was what was called sanitary science. There was a lot of changes going on within medicine in the United States at that time. You have to remember there was no germ theory yet. That doesn't come until after the war. So there was kind of a misunderstanding about what really causes diseases. How do people get diseases? And there was competing theories of contagion theory versus anti-contagion theory. So contagion theory was the notion that people could spread disease from person to person. That there was something that was spread between them. But they did understand that not all diseases got spread that way. There were certain diseases, like yellow fever, for example, that seem not to be contagious from person to person. So how do you get those diseases? And that was part of non-contagion theory. And another way of looking at it is social factors versus environmental factors. People thought that diseases were caused by what's called miasma, that there was some kind of fermentation that happened within like swamps or where there was filth, and that somehow these things got in the air, and when you breathed it in, that caused you to get a disease. So that was the whole notion of miasma theory. So people who believed in miasma theory believed in sanitary science. The way to stop the spread of disease is to have a cleaner environment. We need to clean things up. So the whole goal of miasma theory was prevention. So sanitary science was largely about preventing diseases. We really couldn't do much to cure diseases in most cases, but they could hopefully try to prevent them. And before the Civil War began, there was a big push in many places like New York City and other cities like Boston to try and have some kind of a public health board in the cities and states, to have some kind of police power through the government to enforce these sanitary measures to try and stop it. But it really didn't catch on because there was too much going on. People were worried about the slavery issue, and they never really got going very much with the government pushing for sanitary science. But the war is going to help change all that. So when the war breaks out, you get all these men coming to the military, and you need doctors as well. Now, doctor training in those days was quite different than it is today. There wasn't a whole lot. It wasn't like you just could be a doctor just because you wanted to be. You had to get some schooling. So what you did, you went to school for about 4 months and you listened to lectures about different aspects of medicine, anatomy, and different things. And then you went and worked with a doctor for a short time as an apprentice for a few months, and you came back and listened to the same exact lectures all over again for a few months. And then when you did that, you got your diploma and you were a doctor. So here's some, this is a ticket to get you into a classroom with a doctor to listen to lectures about clinical surgery. Here's another one to listen to lectures at a medical school. And this is a diploma that you would get when you got done with your medical training. Now, once you got the soldiers in the military, you had to do a physical exam. But the problem is the physical exams weren't exactly all that thorough. In fact, one doctor asked a Union soldier, Frank Thompson, who joined a Michigan unit. His physical, according to Frank Thompson, was a firm handshake from the doctor, and the question, "How you feeling today, Frank?" And Frank said, "Fine," and Frank passed. But that's interesting because Frank was actually Sarah Emma Edmonds, a woman, who'd been dreading this physical all along, and the whole physical was just a handshake and how you feeling. Another woman was Albert Cashier, who actually was Jenny Hodgers, wasn't discovered to be a woman until 1913. When she was old and senile and had to go into an asylum, they found out that he was a she, and nobody knew it all that time. So my point is that the fact that you had actually hundreds of known cases of women served in the Civil War show that these physical exams weren't very thorough. Either that or they didn't teach anatomy in these medical schools. Camp illnesses. There are a lot of diseases, what they called crowd diseases, that people contracted once they got in the military. Now you had a lot of rural guys coming in, you had some urban guys coming in. Who were the ones who got sick the most?
Farm boys.
The farm boys. The rural guys did, because they weren't used to these crowd diseases as they were known. in the urban areas, people were exposed to all kinds of illnesses, and they built up some immunity to it. But not these rural guys. They didn't have the immunology against these things, and they came down sick all the time. So you got diseases like measles, chickenpox, mumps, dysentery, and diarrhea. Because the first thing these guys did in the morning when they got out of their tents is they went outside their tent and they urinated right there, rather than use the latrine. It was just convenient. And so guys are getting sick from that: pneumonia, typhoid, malaria, yellow fever. All these guys are getting sick from this stuff. Now, during the Civil War, 4,000 Union soldiers died of measles during the course of the war. Now, it's a lot of us. We probably had measles when we were kids. You know, it was 3 days of scratching and stuff. Not too big of a nuisance. But when you're an adult, measles hit you a lot harder. And these guys had never been exposed to it before. Here's a poster that shows death in the Civil War, and it says killed in action. This is just for the Union. 62,000 men. Died of wounds, 40,000 men. So a little over 100,000 men. Died of disease, 221,000. 221,000. So for every guy who died of a war wound or getting killed in combat, you had 2 men dying of disease. So it was actually more deadly to be in camp than it was to be on the battlefield. Now, I mentioned one of the diseases that people got was yellow fever. Here's Dr. Luke Blackburn. And Dr. Blackburn was a Confederate doctor who came up with a plan during the war. And his plan was a form of biological warfare. While he was in Bermuda, he came up with this great idea of stuffing these trunks full of clothing from yellow fever victims, and then shipping them off to northern cities and creating big epidemics. Kill lots of people. He even packed up one trunk and shipped it to the White House. Oh. He was trying to give Abraham Lincoln yellow fever. But there's one problem with that. And he's a doctor. Yellow fever is not contagious. We know today it's spread by mosquitoes, but it's not contagious from person to person. So having contact clothing wouldn't hurt him. Well, his plan got uncovered when someone finally ratted him out, and the Union soldiers ended up seizing the trunks, and he fled to Canada. And after the war, he finally came back to the United States, and his reward was he was elected governor of Kentucky. Oh. Because to the South, he was a hero for having spread this disease. So he got to be governor because of it. Here's General Benjamin the Beast Butler. Anybody know why he's called the Beast?
New Orleans.
New Orleans. What did he do down there, Doug?
Well, he declared martial law, and a lot of them didn't like it. There was a thing where the women would be walking down the sidewalk, and the Yankee soldiers would be on the same sidewalk, and they'd go to the other side, or they'd get out into the street and throw mud and stuff on the soldiers and spit at them. So Butler declared any woman who did such things was a woman of the night.
Oh.
Yep.
A prostitute.
That's the thing.
And they should be treated as such.
And that's the thing he's most known for. That's why he got his nickname, the Beast Butler. But actually he did something else in New Orleans as well that's pertinent to what we're talking about. All Southerners thought that when the Yankees came down south, they were going to all come down with yellow fever because they weren't accustomed to that, and they were going to drop like flies. And yellow fever was going to be a big savior of the South and kill all these darn Yankees down here. But Butler turned the tables on them. Butler went out and had teams of soldiers go out and just clean up the city. They had quarantines on ships coming in. Anybody had yellow fever, you were quarantined, not allowed into the city. He cleaned up all the streets. They cleaned up the slaughterhouses. They cleaned up the stables. He had these steam pumps that went around pumping standing water out into the rivers and bayous to get rid of it. And in that season of 1862, they had 2 cases of yellow fever. In the past, you had sometimes 3,000-4,000 people dying in New Orleans with yellow fever. 2 cases. And the people in the South were shocked that the Yankees had figured this out, and he had saved the day. Here's a cartoon that was drawn of Butler, and it shows him talking to Lincoln, and he's got a bar of soap under his arm. He's got brooms and dustpans and buckets and stuff. He's looking like a real butler, cleaning up the town, help preventing the spread of yellow fever.
Gary,
Now here's an envelope. Inside this envelope, I've got smallpox scabs. Actually, they're crazies. But people did that in those days. Smallpox was a big killer, and there were two ways of dealing with smallpox. You could either get, to prevent it, you could either inoculate somebody or you could vaccinate them. If you got vaccinated, they took cowpox and they actually would inject it into your arm, and then you got a mild case of cowpox, but it left you immune to smallpox. Or you could get inoculated. They took a smallpox scab like that, they would cut a little opening in your arm or sometimes on your leg, and they would crumble in some of the smallpox scab from somebody who had smallpox with a mild case of it, and then you would get that smallpox, but hopefully a mild version of it, and then you'd be immune to smallpox after that. So here at Elmira in the prison camp, smallpox was one of the leading killers, and I read about cases where people actually mailed scabs to prisoners in the camp so they could try to inoculate themselves. But the problem with inoculation is you don't always know where the scab came from. And sometimes you got a scab from somebody who had some other illness, sometimes venereal diseases, and you ended up getting very sick, and you got these big sores in your arm and all kinds of problems. When the Army was being checked, when they were putting people in the military, they should have been checking for smallpox inoculation, or at least that they had scabs or pockmarks on their bodies to show that they once had smallpox and were immune to it. The Union did a better job of that than the Confederates did. And that's why here at Elmira you had a lot of Confederate prisoners come down with smallpox, as many of them had not been exposed to it and had been let into the military anyway. This shows population of different southern cities in 1860. And the reason I'm showing you this is because the Civil War Army was basically like a city in motion. And in fact, on the Peninsula Campaign, you had General McClellan, he had over 100,000 men in his army. And that's much larger, many times larger than most southern cities. And as this army's traveling around, they're also bringing all these kinds of crowd diseases that you find often in a city. During the Peninsula Campaign that I just mentioned, Union horses and mules left nearly 440 tons of solid waste and over 100,000 gallons of liquid waste on the road every single day. And the soldiers are marching on these roads. Now during the Peninsula Campaign, it's very hot. It's been raining a lot. The soldiers who are marching and are thirsty sometimes just reached down and found a wagon rut in the road full of water and cupped their hand and they took a drink. And that stuff had all that in it. And even the camp surgeon here at the Elmira prison camp, Major Sanger, estimated that every day the men of the Elmira prison camp, which was less than 10,000 men, they expended about 2,600 gallons of urine. Now that's less than 10,000 men. Imagine an army like McClellan's that's got 100,000 men in it, and you can understand why there were so many problems with diseases with soldiers in here.
That's less than a quarter. 10,000.
So, as I mentioned, for every soldier that died in the Civil War, 2 men, from combat wounds, 2 men died from disease. And we might think that that's pretty terrible. But that's better than the Mexican War, where for every man who died in combat, you had 7 men die of disease. And in the Crimean War, it was 1 to 4. So for every soldier in the Crimean War who died in combat, you had 4 men die of disease. So the Civil War actually was an improvement on that, but by our standards, it still sounds pretty bad. But still, being in camp was deadlier than being on the battlefield. Now, what did they take for medications? Well, you had different things here. I'll show you some examples of stuff. This is quinine. Oh, kitty.
Yeah, check it out.
Quinine was offered as a preventative against preventative against malaria. Watch out, kitty.
There you go.
And quinine tastes pretty terrible, so they often mix it with whiskey when they gave it to you. Another thing they gave you was there's blue mass. blue mass were these little blue tablets. Sometimes they could have up and be a big pill. It was a mixture of mercury with licorice and honey and other stuff. And the doctor would often break off a chunk, or he might give you a little blue mass pill. Because in those days, some doctors believed in homeopathic medicine, that like cures like. So if you had diarrhea, the way to cure you was to give you more diarrhea. So they gave you mercury in the form of blue mass, so you would have more diarrhea. They figured that your body would purge itself if they just did that and get your bodily fluids back in balance again. And another medicine they gave was calomel, which also had mercury in it, which would have the same impact on it. Then it was laudanum. It was a laudanum bomb. Laudanum actually was liquid opium. So if they wanted to stop the diarrhea, they would give you opium, either in a pill form or in the form of liquid laudanum. And that would cause you to get constipated and stop the diarrhea. Let's see. So homeopathy was this whole idea of like cures like, and some doctors in the Civil War still use it. Now bloodletting was something they didn't really do much in the Civil War anymore. That pretty much was out of fashion by then, luckily. And let's talk about amputations for a little bit. Well, you really want to get into this, don't you? And let's clear up one misconception about amputation. People have this idea that amputations in the Civil War, they just held you down and they sawed away. But that's really a myth. That almost never happened. In at least 95% of the amputation in the Civil War, you had ether or you had chloroform. And what they did is they put something looked like this, like a funnel, over your face, and there was a handle that came off of it with a tube, and they put a sponge inside, and they would just pour some in there, and then until you were not feeling any pain any longer. You were not unconscious, you were awake. You were basically in like Twilight Zone. But you could hear what was going on around you. You could hear them sawing through your bone, but you didn't feel it. So you were awake. And so almost all amputations were done with ether or chloroform. And they preferred chloroform because ether is very flammable. And if you're amputating at night or in a dark place and you need to hold a lantern close by, you don't want to ignite the ether. So chloroform was much preferred. And here's a mini ball from the Civil War. Pass this around too. You've probably seen these before already, so it's nothing new. But that caused about 94% of the wounds in the Civil War were caused by a mini ball like that. And it's about 58 caliber bullet. And when it hits you, it really shatter your bones. And so that's what led to so many amputations. And when they amputated, the closer to your body they had to the amputation, the higher your risk of death. If they had to amputate your leg close to your hip, 83% of the time it resulted in death. If they took off your toe, it was more like 6%. Or a finger, it was more like about 3%. At the start of the war, the death rate from amputation was around 27%. By the end of the war, it was closer to 15%. Why did that change? Well, first of all, they just simply got better at it. They could do an amputation in 10 to 15 minutes, that fast. So these guys were just doing one after another. They might have 100 guys lined up to have amputations done, so they had to work very quickly. And the second reason it got better is because they started using antiseptics like this, carbolic acid, which is very caustic, but by putting carbolic acid on your wounds, it helped prevent infections. However, it's very painful to have that poured onto a wound because it's very, very caustic. They also used bromine, and they used iodine as well.
What was the second one?
Bromine.
Oh.
They also had the Sanitary Commission gets created by a meeting of women in New York City to try and help the soldiers. So women played an important role in medicine during the war, particularly serving as nurses. Now here's a photo of Florence Nightingale. During the Crimean War, she did much to improve the medical care of the British soldiers during the war. And
Harry, did you ever see some of those photos where a guy they'd actually shortened the guy's arm because the bone had been taken out of it or
Yes.
shattered, and they worked, it's just a little shorter.
yeah, I've seen one of a leg as well. They had the guy who had to wear a special, piece of footwear
Yep.
But yes, it did work. Towards the end of the war, they did get a little bit better about saving some guys' arms and legs, but they really didn't have time.
Yeah.
You could spend hours doing a surgery like that. They didn't have time to do that usually. But all women in the United States want to be like Florence Nightingale and help in the military and serve as nurses. Here's a poster of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was in charge of the nursing corps during the Civil War, and she had certain rules about who could be a nurse. You had to be at least 30. You had to be plain looking. They didn't want any supermodels for nurses. You had to wear brown or black, no hoop skirts or jewelry. Had to be able to read and write, because they wanted you to be able to read to the soldiers, and they also wanted you to be able to write letters for them. And you had to have good morals. So she was very, very strict about who could be a nurse. Here's a letter from a nurse. Emily Parsons was her name. This was written in June 5th, 1863. She says, "I am rather busy now. I have to look after refugees, contraband, soldiers, both black and white, and keep my senses. I have many duties, and I hope and pray that I shall perform them in the right spirit and faithfully. The comfort of many depends in a great degree upon me. I wish I had a little stronger body, that I was a small Hercules, for instance. I wish you could have seen the face of one poor white soldier as I was bathing him the other day. I do get such sweet words and looks sometimes. The world may not think I do much here, but the poor men like to have me around." So a letter like this shows you that, first of all, the job of being a nurse was hard work. She says, "I wish I had a stronger body." And they're also being exposed to all these illnesses and diseases. Sometimes nurses got sick with these illnesses and they died as well. And it also shows that they were very dedicated in this letter. They did a lot of duties for people. The Sanitary Commission so had all these women working, and not everybody liked having women nurses. Here's a message that was written in one Medical Times magazine. "Our women appear to have become almost wild on the subject of hospital nursing. We honor them for their sympathy and humanity. Nevertheless, a man who has had experience with women nurses among male surgical cases cannot shut his eyes to the fact that they, with the best intentions of the world, are frequently a useless annoyance. Cases are continually occurring in male surgical wards of such a character as requires strong arms and attentions which any reasonable medical man is loath to exact from female nurses." So there was some prejudice against female nurses during the war. The Sanitary Commission did a lot of things to help the medical care during the war. They inspected camps to make sure they were set up properly and had proper latrines and so on. They put out publications to officers and doctors about keeping the camps clean, making sure food was prepared correctly. They provided medical supplies and clothing and blankets. They lobbied President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton to name William Hammond as the Surgeon General because he was receptive to the USSC, the Sanitary Commission. Here's a photo of Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who's another key figure in the war for medicine. After the Battle of Bull Run, not a single Union soldier was taken back to Washington, D.C. by an ambulance. Not one. The wagons were all commandeered by fleeing civilians and soldiers trying to get away from the Confederate Army. But by Fredericksburg in 1862, all the wounded were off the field and in the hospital within 12 hours. And that's thanks to the efforts of Jonathan Letterman, because he helped organize an ambulance corps. After the Battle of Peninsula, Letterman was placed in charge of the ambulance corps for the Army of Potomac, and he set up a very dedicated ambulance corps. So he had his own group of men who were trained to go onto the battlefield with litters and take people off. This is why they're under fire, they're doing this, and get these guys into ambulances and move them behind. Here's a picture of an early ambulance in the beginning of the war. This was called a Finley wagon, two-wheeled wagon. And these were absolute torture. The guys who were wounded in these wagons actually asked to be taken out because it was so painful to ride in them. Guys would be bleeding to death inside from the bumpy ride they got. So they had to be replaced by four-wheeled wagons, and Letterman helped make that happen. Letterman set up dressing stations just a few yards behind the battlefront. So assistant surgeons and stewards would go there with a backpack with medical supplies in it and they would start to sort the wounded, and they would treat them. So if a guy had to have an amputation, they would give him something to calm him down, a shot of whiskey or something. They would maybe put some pressure on the wound. They would put him aside, and so they would get treated first. Someone with a minor wound, they would just take care of it, put a bandage on it, you're good. And they would sort through who was bad and who was probably not going to live. From there, you went to the field hospital, which is set up maybe a mile or two behind where the battle was happening. And that might be in a barn, it might be in a hotel, it might be in a church. And they used a flag to designate a hospital. Yellow or red was commonly used to designate a place as a hospital. During the Battle of Gettysburg, they flew a woman's red petticoat on the top of the Lutheran Seminary to designate that that was a hospital. And when you got back all the way to Washington or some city nearby, you might find a regular pavilion hospital you would stay in to get recovered. And they usually put them in cities, outside of cities, because they want you to have fresh air. They also don't want it so that when you start to get a little more mobile, because you're starting to get better, they don't want you wandering out the door and going to a saloon or a brothel. So they like to stay outside the cities with the pavilion hospitals. The pavilion hospitals were specially designed with many windows, lots of space, clean blankets, special diets to help these guys get well. This is following the whole idea of sanitary science, that you got to have clean, fresh air to help these guys get better and not get diseases. Letterman's system of triage is still used to this day. So he was very important in setting up this military system during the Civil War. Another important person was Dr. William Hammond. He became the Surgeon General. He was very supportive of the Sanitary Commission, and he demanded that doctors keep statistics and record cases and send in reports about these cases and how they treated them and how it turned out and so on. He accumulated all this data. He started the Army Medical Museum in Washington, and doctors sent photos or specimens of their cases to be preserved in the hospital so people could learn from this. This is Dan Sickles' leg. It was blown off at Gettysburg. He donated his leg to the Army Medical Museum. In fact, when he went around the country giving talks in the years after the war, he often took his leg with him.
Oh.
And this is his leg. You still see it in the museum today. But Hammond's work led to the publication of the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, which you can read online today. It's all been scanned in. You can go online and read all of it. And as a result, the war led to a lot of benefits in medicine. You see the rise of hospitals, better public health begins to happen because all these doctors come home and all these soldiers come home in the war, and they've learned that being sanitary is the way to go to keep healthy. And also that using military power to enforce these sanitary measures is what has to happen. So cities and state governments begin setting up boards of health and using legislative powers to force people to clean things up and make it healthier. You get better medical evacuation from the field thanks to Letterman. You get more use of antiseptics. Although they didn't understand germ theory, they were doing the right thing for the wrong reason, and it was working. You also had more about prosthetics. All these guys had to have artificial arms and legs. In 1866, 20% of Mississippi's state budget was for prosthetics. 20% of their state budget was to pay for artificial arms and legs. So you also had better plastic surgery as a result of the war. People started doing things to prepare soldiers who had suffered facial damage because of the war. I read about one case, a guy got shot behind the eye with a bullet, and they didn't remove it. They often didn't try to do surgery in your head. They just pretty much left it if you're okay. And he survived. But about 6 or 7 years after the war, he suddenly had this terrible coughing fit, and he coughed up the bullet. But usually if you got shot here to here, they didn't do anything for it. Usually if you got hit in the arm or the leg, they do something for that. If you got hit here to here, they put you aside and said, well, let's see if he lives or not. And then they might think about maybe trying to find the bullet and get it out. But quite often they just left it in there. You also see the rise of hospitals because of the war. Before the war, a hospital was someplace for poor people to go. It's a place you went to die. But now people see hospitals as someplace to go to get well and get better. And you see more hospitals get built. And you see women nurses. Nursing becomes a career for women to work in those hospitals. So the Civil War really did a lot of things to help promote changes in medicine. And it really paved the way for germ theory. All this stuff about sanitary science, about keeping things clean, like I said, they're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, but it worked, and it's going to help them transition right into germ theory, because we know now that keeping things clean also helps prevent germs. So it actually worked out well for them in the end. Thank you.
Thanks. Very interesting.
Get down to Gettysburg, Gary, there's along the York Road there's a big section, there's a sign there now, Camp Letterman.
Yeah,
And he had set up a huge camp right
Yes.
after the battle out there.
yeah, but a lot of it's been taken over by other things, where Camp Letterman
Yeah.
used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's part of it, there's a strip mall on it.
Time marches on.
Yeah, but also this summer we were at went to Frederick, Maryland, because there's a
Yeah,
museum there.
Yes,
Museum of
that's a
Civil
very
Rights. It's a
nice
nice
one.
museum.
Yes,
Yeah,
it
very
is.
nice. I really enjoyed going through that.
Who do you picture here?
Gary Emerson.
Gary Emerson, very
Yeah.
nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
This was-
Thank you for coming down.
Yeah.
Hey,
Thanks for
I
coming over.
read a biography of Noah Olmsted, the landscape
Yes.
painter, not long ago, and
Yeah.
He was involved.
He was very involved with the Sanitary
Yeah.
Commission.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He really did a lot to help make it happen. He complained a lot and got things done. He was very important in the Sanitary Commission. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess Letterman was more of a legacy, and Olmsted went on to Central Park or something
yeah.
like that. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Another guy was, I didn't mention his name, but Elisha Harris was a doctor from New York City. He was hugely important in the war, and also pushed for public health in the years after the war. And he also devised a better transport on the railroad cars for the wounded. He came up with a system using these really large rubber bands. They put the handles of the stretchers through. So when they rode on the train was jolting. It acted like shock absorbers. It kept them more balanced in the train.
This is all
Harris did a lot too.
fascinating stuff.
Oh yeah, there's
I
lots
love that.
of great stuff about medicine in the Civil War.
gosh,
And then
Thank
you had
you
the
again.
most controversial,
Thank you.
famous female doctor, Mary Walker.
Yeah, there was
Yeah.
a female doctor. Yep.
She's the one that they gave the Medal of Honor to and then took away and gave back.
Right.
yes. Oh, my.
She made her own uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then there was Elizabeth Blackwell too. She was instrumental in forming the Sanitary Commission, but they don't usually mention her name much because once the women formed the Sanitary Commission, the men took it over.
Well, if you look at even the formation of the Central Relief Agency in New York City, the officers are all male.
Yeah.
Let the cat go.
When you mentioned the tonnage of manure and urine on the Peninsula campaign, was that something they calculated?
No. Well, they
Or is that
estimated it. They knew about how much an average horse would put out in a day, so they figured out how many horses they had, and they just multiplied and
Well,
figured it out.
the reason I'm asking is because that one picture of the stables down there on the east side, it's got those piles of manure,
Yeah.
and one of the thoughts that went through my head was whether or not we could, and this was before you even brought it up, was whether or not we could even identify how some of that affected each side.
Yeah.
I was talking to Mike about that.
Well, that's where that's where the politicians hung out.
Yeah.